Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. My name is Amelia Bauer, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Birmingham Law Society's Pro Bono Committee. As a committee, our objective is to support, promote, signpost and raise the profile of pro bono work amongst Birmingham Law Society members and the local community. So if you would like to get involved in the committee, or if you'd like any information or support with running a pro bono project, please do get in touch after this webinar. So one of the ways that we promote and raise the profile of pro bono work is by celebrating National Pro Bono Week every year, which takes place every November. Unfortunately, this year, we're really sad that we're unable to host this event in person as we would have liked to, due to difficulties with the ongoing train strikes and then the cancelled train strikes. But we're still so pleased that we can run tonight's event as a webinar instead, and that you're going to hear from our great lineup of speakers. So this year, one of the key focuses of National Pro Bono Week is the climate crisis. And it seems really fitting that this webinar should be taking place whilst COP27 is underway. And there's such a global focus on us all needing to take action to save the planet. So this webinar will be exploring how lawyers, both as businesses and as individuals, can use our legal skills, commercial experience and influence to make a genuine contribution. So tonight we've got four great speakers who will, I'm sure, introduce themselves in a bit more detail soon. But for now, I'd like to welcome Lee McBride, who is partner and head of the environmental team at Lodders Solicitors. We have Emma Montlake, who is joint executive director and head of casework at the Environmental Law Foundation. Nina Pindham, who is a barrister at No. 5 Barristers Chambers, who specialises in planning and environmental law. Now, Nina is actually at COP27 in Egypt and is sadly unable to join us tonight, but she's kindly recorded a short talk for us all to listen to. And last but not least, we have Fiona Nichols, who is Head of Sustainability and Assurance at Gowling WLG. So a big thank you again to all of our speakers for your time tonight and agreeing to speak to us all. So once we've heard from our speakers, we're going to have a quick Q&A session. So if you have got any questions throughout, please do put them in the Q&A function and we'll pick up as many of these as we can at the end. And without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, who is Lee.
Thanks very much. Well, welcome everybody. For those who don't know me, I've been practicing environmental law now for the best part of 30 years. I started out in Queensland, Australia. As you can tell my slightly Australian accent, what is left of it. And I can still remember back in 1987 when a friend of mine said that the next big topic is going to be environmental law, to which I said, I haven't got a clue what you're talking about, but of course, how true that was. Climate change, of course, has become a major issue for the world. If I can just read a quote to you, which is, the overwhelming scientific consensus is that the Earth's climate is warming significantly and that warming is attributable to human activity. I doubt whether there is anybody these days who can stand up and deny that. And that comes, by the way, from scientific consensus. Earth's climate is warming by NASA. For those of you who have been following COP27, you'll be familiar with the quote that came on the radio the other day, which says that we're on the highway to climate change hell. There is also figures out which say the cost of doing nothing is estimated at $9.87 trillion. So it's a very important topic that we're going to get onto tonight. So next slide, please. You'll all be familiar with protests that are going on around the world now, not just in the UK. And if I can just throw a few more quick facts at you. Next slide, please. As you'll be very familiar with the idea that we can't let global temperatures rise more than 2%. Well, the latest figures are basically saying that 1.5% is baked in. Okay, so to reverse that will take some major actions. And of course, we're all familiar with the figures that the last 7 years have been the warmest, threat of extinction to over 1 million species, and lots of natural disasters, which we're seeing on the news every day. Next slide, please. So you'll all be, next slide, please. So you'll all be familiar with Californian bushfires in Australia, and as I said on the slide, you know, bushfires in California have claimed 2 million acres of land in 2021 alone. Next slide, please. Within a place I used to live, Queensland, this is Queensland underwater seemingly. Major flooding in Queensland last year, unprecedented in fact. So those of you who are planning on a holiday, make sure you take a snorkel with you. Next slide, please. But when we talk about climate change, we talk about temperatures. Too often, I think we kind of neglect what is actually the other elephant in the room. Next slide, please. Which is, of course, overpopulation. And overpopulation really goes, in my view, hand in hand with climate change. Next slide, please. So if you just look at population growth, and I'm assuming that you'd be familiar with these figures. If you just look at the change, or the rate of change in London alone. So in 1800, there was 1 million, 1900, 5 million, 2000, 7.2 million. Today, we have 9 million people in just over 220 years. That's phenomenal. Next slide, please. Similarly, if you look at the world's population, similar sort of figures. And funnily enough, at COP27, one of the opening speakers said, today is the day when we've just had our 8 billion people are now on the planet. So we've just gone through 8 billion people, which is incredible, isn't it? And yet, if you look at the projected figure, 2100, there'll be 11.2 billion people on the Earth. But there is some good news. Next slide, please. The good news is that the rate of change in population increase is starting to fall. In other words, if you think of that steep curve, it has started to level off. And if we were all sitting in a room now, I would be asking you the question, in what year did that curve start to fall? I'm not sure whether we can get people to give answers, but I'm just going to carry on anyway because I've only got 10 minutes. And the answer is, next slide, please, 1962. So since 1962, the rate of change of the population has started to fall. Okay, but despite that, we still have this enormous growth of people who all, of course, are using up materials, which is causing emissions and climate change and so on. So what are we all going to do about it is the big question. Obviously, we've got the wider global, wider governmental influences. I'll just quickly deal with a couple of those before we start to get onto individuals and solicitors. Next slide, please. Okay, so some of you will be familiar with the EU response, the Green Deal, which is a major undertaking of, they're saying, €1 trillion of investment with the aim of creating a climate neutral continent by 2050. Next slide, please. Some of the themes that have come out, you'll be familiar with. So they're looking for a 55% reduction in 1990 greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, 50 as they call it. Greater use of hydrogen, more sustainable buildings. They're looking for at least 30 million zero-emission cars by 2030, eliminate pollution, more biodiversity, and so on. Next slide, please. I'm not going to dwell on these because I've got such a short time. What are the UK doing about it? We've got our 10-point plan in the UK. We only seem to react to things that have got numbers in them, as in points. So this is the 10-point plan, November 2020, very similar kind of things. And this is talking about having more offshore wind power, up to 40 gigawatts by 2030. We currently have at 10.5, lower carbon heating. So we're going to have to change our boilers from fossil fuel boilers to something which is more environmentally friendly. We're going to have more nuclear. We're going to have a modular nuclear plant. So in other words, they'll be like a Meccano set that you basically bring on site and put together. Big shift towards zero emission vehicles. You'll all be familiar with electrification of cars, jet zero planes, green ships, all very ambitious. Where's the money coming from? I hear you say. Next slide, please. So we're going to have more of this. Next slide, please. We're going to have more of this. Next slide, please. We're going to have a lot more of this. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so that's a very quick flick through the story so far. I just want to very quickly just touch on ESG, because this is a vital cog in the engine. So we always have these acronyms, don't we? So in the 1980s, we had EHS, environmental health and safety. 1990s, we had sustainability. In 2000, we had CSR, and finally, we finally come across ESG. So next slide, please. What is ESG? I'm sure you've all heard of the term, but essentially, and this I hope encapsulates it for you, it's a framework for evaluating the extent to which a company works on behalf of social goals. Okay, so it's beyond the role of the company just to maximize profits. It's looking wider. See what's the effect of the company in relation to the environment. Okay, and the idea of ESG is to create criteria for investors to make good decisions about material risks and growth opportunities in those companies. So where you've got a company which is destroying the environment, the idea is through ESG for investors to look at that company and go, we need to go somewhere else. Okay, where that company has got a plant which is sitting on a coastline where it's likely to be flooded in the next few years, that's going to be a factor. Okay, so it's about the effect of the company on the environment. Next slide, please. And to give you some examples of that, so when a investor looks at a company, or potential shareholders look at a company, they're going to look at what's the climate change strategy, what's the water efficiency, what's the energy efficiency, what environmental management systems has that company got? We're talking about the largest companies here. How can they demonstrate that they're taking this issue seriously? Next slide, please. So by way of examples of what the UK have done since COP26, and there's not that many of them, but they did introduce some mandatory climate-related financial disclosure requirements, which are affecting, as I say here, 1,300 banks, insurance companies, and LLPs with 500 million turnover or more than 500 employees. Came into effect on the 6th of April 2022. But of course, it's just the start, and we can expect more regulation going forward. You'll see there that I talk about Tesco, Aviva, and Unilever being TFCD disclosure aligned. That's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which comes right off the tongue. And basically, it's trying to create some kind of parameters for which companies can be measured, and the TFCD seem to be the way forward in terms of creating that kind of bar, if you will. So that's just a really quick, next slide, please. That's a really quick skip through, just to give you a kind of a feel of what's going on in the background. Is it too little, too late? That is a major concern for people who've been in the game as long as I have. It really does need to, hit the top bar, the government, but it also needs to trickle down to individuals. And in particular, and tonight's conversation obviously is about solicitors and lawyers. So it's going to be over to you. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope that can help put things into context for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee, for that. That was a really interesting breakneck speed look at what's going on, as you say, in the background. Thank you to Birmingham Law Society for this evening's webinar. Lee mentioned the trickle down to individuals, and so I'm going to pick up at that point and just talk a little bit about the Environmental Law Foundation and what we do as a charity to assist communities who are at the grassroots level of this climate and biodiversity crisis that we are all gathered here today to discuss. First slide, please. Oh, that's just a community that that we work with. Next slide, please. So to talk a little bit about ELF, as I say, we're a charity. We've been around for 30 years. We do all sorts of things. We're a small team, but we were set up 30 years ago in recognition of the vast disparity between of resources between the communities who may be experiencing environmental harm and those who may be doing the environmental harm. And so these are the inquiries that ELF picks up. We take in about 300 inquiries a year through our advice and referral service. And we assist those communities both through our in-house support, but we also have a membership, professional membership, pro bono network of lawyers and barristers and environmental consultants who will give free assistance to the communities that we refer to them. We also have established a clinic network that's partnering with universities. This is under the clinical education movement. We have legal clinics and policy clinics. Those sit with 20 universities. The legal clinics, we refer matters to students, community environmental matters, which are worked on by students and are proving very, very popular. That's students working on matters under supervision of an environmental academic. We also have our policy clinics at partner universities. Last year, through a research project that we put together with participating universities, we produced our local urgency on the climate emergency report. That was looking to see what local authorities who had declared climate change emergencies were actually up to and what the landscape looked like. We put on lots of community events. We partner with academics and professionals, bringing together communities that we work with to hold these events. The March event this year, Reviving British Waterways, was really interesting, looking at what local communities are doing in relation to marine and river pollution and the support that is being provided by the professionals and scientists. We also do policy work and we, whilst we are a non-campaigning organisation, we do campaign on particularly on access to justice issues, cost barriers and policy change. Next slide, please. As we have discussed, the grassroots communities that ELF works with really are on the front line of the climate and biodiversity crisis. We are there to assist communities with advocating for their local environment and the preservation of such. When a community contacts ELF, they do so because they're driven by a desire to preserve and protect something, and that is our starting point. We see a huge amount of inquiries coming through ELF around land development. Of course, we know land development is driving not only climate change but also biodiversity loss, and we recognise obviously in this country that as a Western country, we are one of the most nature depleted in the world, sadly. So we really are seeing on the ground through the communities that we work with sorts of loss, whether that's green space, European protected species that are threatened by land development, and around that we are very much involved in lots of local planning applications, supporting communities to take Rule 6 status in planning inquiries, participating in draft local plan making, and even on occasion assisting communities to respond to development consent orders. That's the major infrastructure project. So it's very busy. We see a whole range of different environmental and public interest inquiries coming through ELF. It's constantly fascinating and keeps us on our toes. Next slide, please. I thought the organisers of the event thought it would be quite interesting for ELF to discuss how we work very closely with the environmental professionals. We have, as I said before, we are supported through the assistance that we can give in-house by a pro bono membership for solicitors, barristers and environmental consultants. We currently have over 60 professional members, and we calculate that the pro bono provision through ELF, that's our in-house support, and that of our professionals is somewhere in the round of 10,000 hours of pro bono support annually. So it is pretty significant. Obviously, from the point of view of our communities who benefit from this pro bono offer, the benefits to them and to ELF are clear. However, what we would say to professionals who might be interested in working with ELF, the benefits for them are, especially for the newly qualified professionals, that they may experience work that they may not get that experience at that level of qualification so early on in their career. And also, frankly, we just see so many fascinating and interesting cases coming through our service that we would say to people that it really is really interesting work. We also have now trialled a placement with a trainee solicitor. We had a secondment from Rich and Buxton solicitors this year, which was really super, actually, both for ourselves and for that trainee solicitor working on the front line at a busy environmental law charity. Again, that's something that that professional membership can benefit their involvement with us. And then finally, obviously, we work with universities, and from the law students' point of view, there are some great opportunities, I would say, working with ELF, and indeed we hope that we get that exposure to law students at a formative stage in their career. It is very popular work, the legal clinics and the policy work, and that there will be exposure to the importance of not only pro bono but also those public interest cases, which we would say is obviously we are looking at forging and shaping the environmental lawyers of the future, of which we are going to be in great need. Next slide, please. I thought I'd just give a few examples of the sort of work that we get involved with. Often we find that climate change and the biodiversity crisis seem to be taken as two separate elements of planetary crisis, but actually we think of those two elements as being part of the same conversation. Biodiversity has been massively impacted by climate change, and indeed, as I've already mentioned, a lot of the work we do, such as land development, a lot of the land development work we do is obviously fueling the biodiversity crisis. So this is an example of a matter we were very involved with at the beginning of the year. The picture you can see there is vile Clive Vale local wildlife site in Hastings after it had been cleared by the developer, who quite quickly afterwards sent in an environmental consultant to undertake a environmental assessment of what was there. Well, as you can imagine, not an awful lot. But 6 months later, fortunately, nature bounds back. It's looking in much better health. Having said that, there was a planning application that was submitted by the owner's developer, and we assisted the local community with the advice of one of our technical consultants at seeing off that application. So that serves as one example of the sort of local work that we're involved with. Next slide, please. This is Park Road allotments. These are historical, treasured allotments in Isleworth in London. We've been assisting this community now for nearly 5 years in respect of various applications that keep coming through from Northumberland Estates. That's the Duke of Northumberland who actually owns the allotments. He is desperate, or the Northumberland Estates is desperate to build on those allotments, and we've been supporting the community in their Rule 6 status to see off those applications and then appeals. They were jubilantly successful 3 years ago when planning inspector refused the Northumberland Estates appeal against refusal. Unfortunately, we're back in a similar situation now with a further application, and again we're waiting to hear whether the community has been granted Rule 6 status. Next slide, please. This is my final slide and final example of just the heroicism of the communities that we work with. This is relates to a village green, a designated village green in 2006 in Boreham Wood, and the community there who have been fighting off development of this incredibly special local wildlife site for, well, decades now. The most recent being an application by the landowner to deregister part of the village green, and following a 2-week public inquiry this year, the planning inspector did actually decide that the village green could be deregistered. This is now subject to judicial review proceedings, and indeed we've been granted permission, so we wait and see what happens there. But all these examples have had the very large input of our professional membership, and as I say, without whom ELF would be a rather lonely charity with probably no friends. Anyway, I'm sure I must be at the end of my 10 minutes now. I hope that's interesting, and thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Our next speaker, Nina Pindham, who is a barrister specialising in planning and environmental law at No. 5 Chambers, sadly can't be with us this evening, but rather excitingly, that's because she's currently at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. So she has actually sent us a video to share with us, which is just a short message from her. And I will just share that video with you now.
Hello, remote from Sharm el-Sheikh. I am so sad that I am not able to join you tonight to discuss this really, really critical issue, fundamental issue of pro bono legal representation. I am here pro bono as it happens, so this is a good example of the very important routes that pro bono can take you down and the unpredictable places it can take you. UNFCCC conferences, for example. I managed to find a quiet corner. It is absolutely chaos here. I heard someone compare this to the Fire Festival. I think that might be a slight discredit to the organisation here, but not so far off. It is manic. So I'm very glad that your genius organisers have managed to work things so that I'm able to make this very small contribution to reiterate just how crucial pro bono work is. As I said, it can take you to peculiar desert resorts in Egypt. It can also, again in my experience, take you to the United Nations in Geneva. That was somewhere I went to again on a pro bono case. And more importantly, I think we should all remember there are members of society who would not be able to afford legal representation and might not be aware of their legal rights, but for the assistance of pro bono lawyers, particularly in the world where we are in, where legal aid has been cut to the bone. So it is such an important issue. I am so sad that I'm missing this discussion. Perhaps it's, as you can hear, my voice is going a little bit. It's only the beginning of the week 1 at COP, and I've only slept 3 hours, I think, max every night. So I'm slightly worse for wear, but very interesting times here indeed. And if you undertake pro bono work as students or practicing lawyers already, you will, I'm sure, reap the benefits, not only in terms of feeling that you're contributing to society, but potential benefits to interesting places, interesting cases, and interesting things to do. So I cannot emphasize enough how important it is we all undertake pro bono work, how important the work that Birmingham is doing, university, and also those representing various organisations on the panel, Environmental Law Foundation, etc., and the law firms who have been so generous in giving associates time to pro bono work. And I do have to leave right now, so thank you so much for allowing me to have make this contribution and have this very small part in this wonderful evening tonight. I wish I could be joining you, but thank you for letting me make a small contribution. Bye.
And I'll hand over now to our last speaker, Fiona Nichols.
Yes, thank you for inviting me along to this. I'm coming this from a slightly different angle because I'm not a lawyer, but I do work in a law firm, and I have done for 7 years. So I hope I know a little bit about lawyers and hopefully a little bit about how law firms and the environment work. Just to give a bit background to me, I started out in this in 1997 when I don't think anybody was really doing this, and it was the times when the EU was starting to boot up its laws and regulations, and there was nobody to actually implement them within business at that time. So they paid for me to do an MSc in environmental protection and law to hopefully help the businesses of the future. So hopefully that's what I'm trying to do now. So that's a little bit about me. I'm gonna focus on 2 things. The first thing, if you want to move on to the next slide, is just saying how I think, sorry, it's a bit faded at the top, but it says what law firms can do. And it's also what law firms and what lawyers can do. From my experience of the last sort of 7 years of working in a law firm and sort of the opportunities that have come my way, which have been many, which is why I'm still here. The doors keep opening, which is a very positive thing. So I just wanted to sort of give my thoughts on where that's coming from. So for me, I think what law firms can do, well, they can take on enthusiastic specialists like me, for one thing. I think having somebody who can help coordinate and drive things, as well as do the very practical stuff, making sure it's obviously legally compliant with the law, obviously quite important in a law firm, that we're squeaky clean on those sort of things. So that's part of my role. But having somebody who's enthusiastic and constantly bugging people is quite useful. So that's part of my role. I consider myself a constant pain in the backside for a lot of people, but things do tend to sort of move along if you do that more and more. But also other things that we do is bring together the people that are enthusiastic. It's often very difficult when there's people, lawyers or whoever they are, or over a law firm that are really enthusiastic and want to do things, to try and bring them together and give them opportunities to do more. So that's one of my roles. And we have a central, what we call Planet Plus team of ambassadors, which includes 4 partners, each representing our sort of legal practice groups. And that is quite galvanizing, not only for the others that are there, but also for sort of making progress throughout the business. Another thing I think is about sort of, I mean, this is all talking about leading at the moment. So in talking about tackling thorny issues, that can be quite troublesome. And conservative law firms in particular would rather sort of follow rather than lead. And actually making sure you're part of those conversations is quite helpful for the business, not only to sort of learn for itself, for the lawyers to learn those thorny issues and get on top of them before they're even really anybody else has. And to give you an example of that, I mean, Lee mentioned about TCFD. We're not regulatory bound by TCFD yet, but we will be, but we want to get ahead. So we're going to implement those sort of recommendations before it becomes mandatory to do so. We've just this week signed a commitment to the Science Based Target Initiative. We don't have to do that. Some clients are asking for it, but not an avalanche at the moment. But because we set a commitment in 2017 to go zero carbon, and that was an ambition at that time when nobody else was doing it, it's only right that we now sort of sign up and actually put our money where our mouth is and actually sort of advertise that and promote it more widely and be seen to be leading on those things. There are other things we're doing as well. A very interesting thorny issue at the moment that we're looking at, and to want to be in the melee of the conversation that's going on, is what about onboarding clients, thinking about, you know, who are the clients that have got difficult sort of emissions issues, shall we say, around them? What does that mean for a law firm? And that is a debate that the legal press is sort of engaging with, but we are also engaging with and starting to think about. It's difficult, and we need to think about what that means for lawyers and law firms, but we are tackling that. Another thing is about being honest and authentic. We're not doing everything right. We're not probably pushing ourselves as far as we could go, but being honest about how far you can go and authentic about what you are doing is part of the message here. And that's linked to the greenwashing side of things, but actually it's just about feeling good about what you're doing. And we're doing an awful lot. We don't always shout about it as much as we should, but we need to, and actually just accept that we are all, dare I say it, on a journey. So those are some of sort of the lead sort of elements I want to talk about, but there's also educating, being thought leaders in the business. I mean, we've got lawyers in our business. There's not enough, in my opinion, that are shouting more loudly, getting out there on LinkedIn, doing blogs, doing presentations, but it is building and that momentum. And I think using our partners, shall I say, to try and push that and build and educate across the business is part of my job too. It can't just be about the two passionate environmental greenies sitting in the corner. It has to be everybody that is involved, at least to a certain degree. We can't all be as enthusiastic, as passionate as each other. We've all got our own sort of things that we're passionate about, but nonetheless, there is a level of education that's needed. I mean, obviously, this all makes good business sense as well. So using the right language also helps push these agendas forward. In terms of very practical pro bono, I mean, most of my talk isn't specifically about pro bono, but we are a signatory to the Chancery Lane project, which has lots of benefits, whether it's developing clauses for the benefit of everybody, which is legal clauses for the benefit of everybody. But internally, we can use those clauses ourselves, and we can use them in advice. So that's a classic example of where it makes good business sense to be part of those kind of programs, as well as just feeling good about it. Motivating people. I mean, I had a volunteer today. I had a trainee solicitor that's joined the firm, seems to be the trainees more than most, but not only, who came to me and said, what can I do? And I think, you know, I think matching those people with the projects and things that we're trying to do and enabling them to be interested and passionate about it and work within their own teams or other parts of the business to get to sort of, you know, enact what they're interested in. So we've got that. We've just recently done a biodiversity competition as well, which enabled prospective lawyers, shall we say, to sort of, what do they think about what clients and law firms should do about biodiversity? So that's what we explored in that topic. But what it came out of it was we got some really interesting entries. We'll probably nick some of those ideas that they've put in our own nature plan, but also we're offering them a prize to come and have an opportunity to potentially come to our law firms, which is great for them and good for us too. Positive messaging, always important in my part. I don't want to see a sprout on my desk that I've not switched off my computer screen. I think that's negative messaging. So I tend to use very positive messaging and celebrate successes as well. Sharing is quite an interesting one, starting to think about projects working with other law firms. We can't do it by ourselves, so working with other law firms is one really good way we can make things accelerate much faster in what we're doing. Some of those thorny topics we talked about earlier are much easier to do if you're hammering them out with others, and then you can come up with more authentic, shall we say, messaging, and it looks good to clients. Clients want to know that the law firms are working together, particularly if we're on frameworks. So it's got lots of reasons for doing it, but most of all, it's just to sort of get ahead of those issues and try to make meaningful change. It's not just about our offices. Our offices can do their bit, but they are nowhere near as powerful as our clients or our suppliers. So getting those sort of sides of things involved is really important. In terms of just doing, I think a lot of people talk about stuff. I think you just have to get in it. It's quite difficult sometimes, some of these topics, but you just have to get on with it. And that's basically what we're trying to do. Get our hands dirty a little bit and try some of these things. They won't all be successful, but they will learn, and we will learn from doing those things and trying out those different things. So that's all I'm going to say about that side of what I do. But I used to do something else, and this is where the pro bono angle from my own personal experience and of law firms has been was really helpful. So can you put the next slide on, and I'll just sort of introduce you to a project. So this project was called St. John's Sunshine. I set it up about 10 years ago with a couple of other founder directors. It was an entirely voluntary project, and it came about because I met an enthusiastic vicar who wanted to put solar panels on the roof of his church. And I was passionate about co-ops, which were fundamentally sustainable, and also had some of the skills and expertise to sort of help them help the sort of community raise some cash for these solar panels. They didn't have any cash, so they wanted to galvanize the community to do that. So I helped them sort of think about how to do that. And I'll say help them, I was part of it and learned myself from everybody else, having not really been in a community project myself before. But a big part of that, it was quite a complex project in many ways. We set up a community benefit society, which was brand new. We had a church that wanted solar panels, and we had a community centre that was going to benefit from those solar panels. And they were all completely different entities, quite a legal minefield, and certainly way beyond me. So we identified some pro bono support, which actually ended up being DLA Piper, as it happens, and I will give them a shout out here. They basically helped us come up with a lease agreement to help us. How were we going to manage this process? So this project was destined to last 20 years or more. There was income going to come in from it that was going to support the community centre, and we just wanted to do nice things in the community, to be quite frank. So we needed lawyers to help us do that, and they were incredibly patient. You do have to be patient with community groups, including the one I was involved in. Churches go incredibly slowly, and as do sort of community groups. It goes at that pace, and so we needed somebody who would just hold our hand, produce those documents, and enable us to sort of make it a safe project, because we were worried about the future. There were some risks. We were holding people's cash, so we've still got that cash, and I'm still part of this project to some degree as a member and an investor. So it's it was very, very powerful to have sort of a law firm that you could trust, and a lawyer that you felt you could bounce your ideas off. So from the point of view of being on the sort of that end of pro bono, I'm so pleased it existed. I didn't know it existed at the time, so I was extremely grateful for that. So that's basically all I was going to say. So I wanted to give sort of two sides from my lawyer involvement, and hopefully that's been helpful. And now I'll hand back to you and answer any questions if there are any.
Thanks so much, Fiona, and thank you again to Lee, Emma and Nina for your really interesting and powerful talks. We've heard tonight there's clearly a lot of really good pragmatic ways that we can be contributing as lawyers, and it's great to see that there's so much positive environmental pro bono work going on. We've had a few questions for our panellists, so I'm going to hand over to Lucy and Amy, who are going to take us through the questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Amelia, and thank you to everyone for all your talks. That was absolutely fascinating to listen to. We have got some questions. Before I dive into the Q&A questions, I was wondering if one of the panel members would mind just explaining what the Chancery Lane project is, because I know that is a really important thing in environmental law and pro bono, and I'm pretty sure we're going to have some attendees that aren't familiar with that. So it would be great if someone wouldn't mind just explaining what that is.
Well, I mean, I can give a few sentences on it.
It'd be great, Emma. Thank you.
I mean, we at ELF, we don't do commercial contracts, etc. But so far as I'm aware, it was established a couple of years ago in order to create commercial clauses for contracts that would facilitate better climate change contracts. So I think the point being that as lawyers, not only, as Fiona has said, can they be used internally in law firms, but they can also be promoted to clients. And of course, I suppose for those very big commercial law firms dealing with the very big commercial clients, where you're starting to make that shift through the use of enlightened climate change clauses, and in that filtering effect, that is quite that has the potential to be quite a profound change. So yes, it's trying to develop better climate change clauses for commercial contracts, and there's lots of templates and precedents that the Chancery Lane project is coming up with. So it's a great project.
Yeah, fantastic. So great way maybe for lawyers whose core practice may not be environmental law to be able to kind of engage with pro bono in this sphere. Okay, thank you. We've got some big questions coming up in the Q&A, so I will go with a couple of them. We've got a question saying, first of all, thank you for a brilliant series of mini presentations. And they're referring to Lee McBride talking about beyond ESG. So I suppose what the next steps are for the future. And they're asking, is the natural development of this topic not all about respecting the importance of people who climate change affects, so i.e. everybody? And what are the panel's thoughts on whether the law should really now be moving to being geared up to individual behaviour within the national and international spheres? So I suppose what they're asking there, I think, is the next step to try and really make the law address and perhaps even restrict individuals' behaviour. I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts on that. That is a really big kind of question to pose.
Can you still hear me? I seem to have lost my picture.
Oh, we can still hear you, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is an interesting one, isn't it? Because the natural focus will tend to be on the big, heavily polluting companies. So, you know, if you look at the recent Shell case, where you had individuals who were going after directors on the basis that they weren't complying with what they should be doing as directors, and basically saying that Shell should be doing more. Now they're big headline grabbing, that's a big headline grabbing example of how you've got activists who are going after those big companies. But you know, at the end of the day, it is all down to individuals. So I mean, if I think of the best example I can think of is really one which is close to home for everybody. So it took something like 25 years for the UK to introduce green and brown wheelie bins as a compulsory way of dealing with waste. Okay, 25 years after Australia introduced it. Okay, so the question then is that impeaching on my human rights to do what I want in terms of how I get rid of mine? To my mind, you've got to have some kind of regulation. Okay, There have to be certain rules that we all follow in order for all to benefit within our community. So that's just one example of how, so that's an individual impact on us, okay, as against going after the global giants. I guess it's all a question of these things, whether it's individual going after the bigger companies, going hand in hand, because it's one thing to start at the top, as government has, and I gave that example earlier about financial disclosures of the larger companies. That's one thing. But we shouldn't just start at the top. We should be starting at the top, middle, and bottom in terms of what individuals do. And that involves, I think, as Fiona was suggesting, really, it's getting people motivated. So at my firm, we sat down and said, well, what are we going to do about this particular issue? And the first thing we did was ask people what they wanted to do. Because it's very easy, isn't it, to say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to introduce this lighting, this waste recovery, plant trees, whatever it is. But if you don't have people motivated, then you'll get nowhere. And the other thing to say is, particularly within firms, it's really a matter for the managers at the top to recognize that they cast a long shadow. They've got to set the example. If they're not interested, how do you expect employees to be interested? And so we really gave that some thought and made sure that whatever decisions we did take, everybody was behind it for the benefits of everybody. Sorry, I'm going slightly off piece there, but I think that's a really important point to recognize. You've got to have people engaged, and this is where pro bono, this is where lawyers come in. You guys are bright people. Yeah, you're the ones who should be leading. As the questioner asked, it is really a matter of benefit for individuals, not just benefit for large global companies who can use greenwashing or, look how great we are to benefit. But that answers that question.
It does. Thank you so much. We've got a lot of questions. I'm concerned we're not going to get through them all, but we will try a few more. There was one that came in earlier. I can't see it in the Q&A now, but Amelia drew my attention to it, which I think is probably maybe most relevant to Fiona, but actually maybe Lee as well. In fact, definitely Lee as well. And that was, to what extent do you think law firms, and I guess chambers as well, should have regard to ESG when they are taking on clients or thinking about their client profile? And I think, Fiona, you did touch on that briefly when you were speaking. Is that something that law firms are doing, should be doing?
Well, I'm going to speak at it from a non-lawyer perspective. I'm not a lawyer. So the lawyers will say everybody's entitled to a defense. I will say, I will have caveats to that. And actually, the lawyers that I'm talking to, they go across a whole spectrum. Some say, well, no, that's a cop-out. And some say it's, I still believe they're entitled to defense. I'm quite pragmatic, though I'm quite deep green. I'm working in a corporate law firm on purpose, because talking to people like me isn't going to make any change. So I chose to go into difficult places and difficult businesses, if you like, to challenge myself. And I think that's why I think it's important that lawyers and have the conversation. I think that's what it's all about. And that I did allude to it because there is a project that our CEO has just said, yes, Fiona, I would take your recommendation to join that. I've got my caveats, even myself, that I want to understand a little bit more about. But one of the clauses we're proposing, or one of the, it's a charter through the Legal Sustainability Alliance. And one of their charter principles is that if we will work with clients, but if they basically choose not to make any changes and they ultimately are against the principle of keeping under 1.55 centigrade increase, then we should be thinking about not taking them on. Now, that's a very big thing for a law firm to sign up to do. And that's why it's part of a conversation. That's not going to happen overnight. And I'm not even sure it'll ever happen. I'm not sure yet. But the point is, we want to get involved in that conversation. There are law firms like Clifford Chance that have set up a process to do that. And actually to discount sort of taking on, they have said and come out and said they didn't take on a client because of that very reason. Now, that's quite a big thing to say. That's only one client, but that's one client, and that's one client more that wasn't happening last week. So I think from the non-lawyer perspective, that's what I would say. I'd be interested to see what Lee would say from the lawyer perspective.
Oh, sorry, I've just been talking to myself for 20 seconds. I think that is a really difficult one. And I'm not just saying that as a partner in a law firm, because I think there's different ways of tackling this issue. So for example, what some law firms are doing, they're looking down their supply chains and saying, who's supplying us? Who's supplying our electricity? Who do we deal with in relation to all sorts of things that make a law firm work? And I think that's a really good thing. To come out and say, well, we're not going to act for Shell, we're not going to act for BP, and all the rest of it. I do wonder whether there's a kind of a mixed message there. On the one hand, you might say, well, isn't that a really good thing? On the other hand, should a law firm be standing up and saying, ex-client over there is bad for the environment? I'm not sure about that. I think I've never, to be honest, I've never been asked the question, should we or shouldn't we be acting for this particular client? I mean, you could go further and say, well, should a criminal law firm ever act for criminals? So it's a difficult one.
It is, but thank you so much. It's really interesting to hear your perspectives on it. Amy, we've got lots of questions in the Q&A. I know it's 7, but I'd love to just spend 5 more minutes just taking a couple more if we could. Did you have any thoughts as to what we should go to next? Because I'm struggling to choose. We've got so many.
We do have a few. Well, I just thought that there was one that was different from some of the others. If anybody has any answers to this one, that would be grateful, because I'm conscious that we have quite a few students on the call, and a student has asked a question about how they can get involved in environmental pro bono work. So I don't know if that's one that maybe Emma might be able to comment on, but equally, if Lee and Fiona have any ideas, please jump in.
That would be great. And we also had a sort of general question earlier, I think, from a student saying, they're interested in a career in environmental law. Any tips or advice, again, maybe from Lee or Emma, on pursuing this as your career area?
Yes, thanks. I guess it depends from my point of view what area of environmental law you want to be involved in, whether it's the sort of more regulatory side, which I think is more what Fiona and Lee's firms do, or an organisation like ELF. We work with a lot of the third-party litigation firms, such as Richard Buxton's and Lee Day, and that's a whole different area, I guess, of environmental law, where you're looking at environmental challenge to decisions, for example. So I sort of think it's a slightly smaller area that we work with. It possibly doesn't pay as well as other areas of environmental law, but it's incredibly rewarding. And certainly my local heroes, local nature heroes are the communities that we work with, and are standing up for nature every day. So how to get involved in that? Well, there are a few areas, like Friends of the Earth, for example, have an internship, a year internship. If you're at university, for example, you might be at a university that is partnering with ELF and get some experience through that. Or, as I say, we do from time to time look at working with new up and coming environmental lawyers. So there are opportunities there. I would just say, take whatever opportunities you can and where you find them. you know, even if you're involved in another area of the law, it might be, certainly we work with some law firms who, although they can't work with us directly because of potential conflicts of interest, they do work with us behind the scenes. We get a lot of inquiries from big law firms whose trainee solicitors are pushing that desire, as Fiona has said. You know, there's a lot of enthusiasm coming up from younger members of the profession who are really now going, okay, we want to do something, and we're seeing that as a driver from law firms perhaps reaching out to work with ELF, who might ordinarily have not done so before. So yeah, there are opportunities. I guess there may be other opportunities that Lee and Fiona can mention in the areas of environmental law that they participate in.
Yeah, shall I just give you just 30 seconds on how I became an environmental lawyer, if you will? Aside from the chap in 1987 saying the environmental law is going to be the next big thing, which was that, so I started out and still am a commercial property lawyer. And I get involved in, you know, large corporate deals and large property deals where there is an environmental element. So you might be dealing with contaminated land. You know, who's going to take the risk of liability? Is it going to be the buyer? Is it going to be the seller? How are you going to deal with cleanup? What investigations are you going to carry out? And so what I did over a period of years was just got more and more into that area as it became more of a topic politically and, you know, in every other way, really. So I think you will have, I think it broadly spans out into three areas. I think you've got your litigators, your environmental litigators, you've got your environmental property lawyers, you know, for the due diligence aspect and making sure that sellers and buyers and corporates, etc., are all in compliance with the law when you're doing a transaction. And then you've got the sort of planning side of it as well, which falls into, for example, dealing with issues such as biodiversity, net gain, and environmental assessments, and so on. So that, to my mind, they're the kind of the three areas generally within a law firm where you decide, I think, as a lawyer, whether you want to tack the environmental bit onto, you know, planning, litigation, property, or whether you want to do it exclusively. And I think there are very few lawyers within large law firms who can honestly say they do nothing else except environmental law. I can remember once going to a cocktail party and got introduced to somebody that said, oh yeah, I said, what do you do? They said, I'm an environmental lawyer. And when I sort of scratched the surface, they meant they were a health and safety lawyer. So it depends on what you want to call yourself and how you do it, basically. But I think it's those three areas where you'll find yourself doing maybe 50-50 or 60-40 or something like that, you know, pure property, 40% environmental law. But it will usually, you'll usually be dealing in a relatively large transaction where you'll really be called in as a specialist. That's been my experience. Fiona, do you want to add to that?
I'm not sure I can add too much to that. So rather than take us over, give more opportunity for another question.
Okay. Amy, shall we take one more question? Because I don't want to keep our panelists too long, and I'm conscious that we've gone past 7.
Yes, that's a great idea. Do you want me to put one forward?
I don't mind. I was wondering if it'd be interesting, again, a really different type of question, to get the question from the Legal Services Board who have joined today, asking about the panel's views on whether there is, or maybe in the future, a role for legal regulators in the environmental law space. I think it'd be interesting to hear what their thoughts are on that.
be honest, I'm not quite sure what that question is asking. A role for legal, what do they mean by legal regulators? Sorry.
Oh, well, I think they maybe mean, so how I've taken it, but this may be viewed differently, is whether there is a need for tighter regulation in the practice of environmental law more generally.
Sorry.
You
Go
go.
ahead.
No.
Okay. Yeah. No. All I was going to say is I think there is there's lots of law out there. There's lots of regulation out there. There's lots of regulatory bodies out there, and I think sometimes if you're in the ESG field, for example, at the moment, and you're trying to pull it all together and understand that field and understand the regulation below it, you could spend days, weeks, and years trying to get a proper grip on it. So as I say, I do think there is lots of regulation out there. If there are enough regulators out there, and I'm thinking now in terms of EA officers and the kind of work they do, that is an issue. I don't know whether Emma's got any experience on that, where trying to get regulators to regulate before it's too late can be an issue.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, and agree with Lee. There is a lot of regulation out there. The problem is the lack of enforcement. So, we know the Environment Agency, for example, in the last 10 years, the prosecution rate has drastically fallen away by something like about 85%. As to where it was in 2010. We see what's happened with the water industry, and they're effectively being deregulated and being left to them to do their own monitoring, which we know has, in my view, been a catastrophe. Look at Southern Water and their £91 million fine last year. So yeah, there is a lot of regulation, and unfortunately, it feels like it's not being properly enforced. And we see that with statutory nuisance as well. There's a whole raft of community matters that we deal with on a day-by-day basis, where communities are absolutely beyond frustrated that they're just not being listened to, or they're just, I think a lot of it is frankly, sadly, down to resources and a lack of. That's my rant over.
Thank you so much, everyone. Amy and Amelia, I think we could probably go till 8 o'clock answering questions, because we've been really inundated and we already had questions ourselves that had been emailed in before. But I think, do you think, Amelia, that we probably should close because we're coming up to 7:15, and we don't want to keep take up too much more of our panelists' evening. So I'll hand back to Amelia to say thank you to everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Thank you again to all of our panelists for staying a little bit later than initially planned. I'm sure everyone who's attended has found this incredibly interesting and useful. So really, thank you very, very much. And thanks to everyone for attending as well. We all know after the last few years, we've had many a Zoom webinar, I'm sure, and it's unfortunate that we couldn't be in person today, but thanks very much for making the effort to come tonight. Webinars like this are a really important step in starting discussions about what lawyers can do to contribute towards tackling the climate crisis, but they really are just a first step. So it's very important, I think, that we can all take away from tonight's webinar and perhaps play more of a role as individual lawyers and as businesses. So as I mentioned at the start, please do get in touch with me, Lucy, or Amy as well if you'd like to be involved with the Pro Bono Committee in Birmingham Law Society. We are very, very happy to welcome new active members from different firms in the city, and we'd love to hear about what pro bono projects you're working on, especially if they're environmental projects. So thank you again for everybody, and I hope you have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you.